Hello and welcome to the Pivot Leadership Podcast. We're here to explore the intricacies of leadership, explore the science behind it, and hopefully learn a few things along the way. I developed the Pivot framework to help change work environments for the better. Pivot uses neurological science to help leaders understand their colleagues and analyse their own feelings and responses. All in all, we aim to enhance mental well-being, improve performance, and benefit everyone involved. So what does pivot mean? To pivot, you need perseverance, inclusion, value, optimization, and trust. With my guests, we'll unpick these principles and discuss how each one is vital in building strong leaders. On today's episode, we're discussing value within leadership and teams and how this can build influence within the corporate world. I'm joined by Sophie Milliken, who is the founder and CEO of Moja Group. Moja work with entrepreneurs and senior executives to amplify their personal profiles and become known authorities in their industries. Sophie has just launched her new book, From Unknown to Unforgettable, which helps people build a personal brand that goes beyond the bio. In this episode, we'll explore how Sophie helps leaders to build their profiles and how this can build value and influence in the workplace. Welcome to the podcast, Sophie.
Thanks for having me, Emma. I'm a big fan of your podcast, so it's great to be on as a guest.
Oh, that's so kind. Can you tell us a bit more about you and your business?
Gosh, where do I start? I mean, you gave me a great introduction there. So I own and run Moja, which is a modern PR agency based in Newcastle, but we operate all over the place and we work with founders and senior leaders to raise their profiles. So it's personal branding, but I'm not a fan of that term because I think people think of social media and viral posts and all that sort of stuff, whereas I think we're the substance behind that. So I think all the stuff that we do is the type of activities that people can then share on their social media. So things like awards, podcasts, speaking engagements, books, networking, all these different things that kind of all add together. And then at the point where there's a story to tell, that's the point where we push it out through press and media.
Yeah, I love this. This is like the most exciting part of the Pivot program is talking about value. And then when you wrote your book, I just had to have you on because I just felt this connection with everything that you talked about in terms of building profile for influence. And actually, it's like the missing piece for leadership development in corporates, because I often hear leaders say, no, I'm not doing that kind of promotion on myself to share my value because it's a bit ick, it's not appropriate. But actually, if they did, I could see the impact that would have and how much it would make their lives easier in the corporate world on a day-to-day basis.
That is such a common objection or concern, if you like. And, I spent 12, 13 years in John Lewis, so I'm very much from that corporate background originally. And I can imagine many of my former colleagues having that exact same thought. And I think sometimes when you're in a corporate, especially when you've been in the same one for a long time, you've got that almost safety net of being in that big environment. And you don't see necessarily the need to put yourself out there because you're thinking that you're safe in that environment. And sometimes you are, which is amazing. But, with the likes of John Lewis as a great example, that environment, retail, was not safe. And actually, they've had lots of restructures since I left. And I often get people, every time there's a restructure, I'll get former colleagues get in touch with me and ask how they can do some of this stuff because they've been out of the loop and they've been very kind of insulated in their corporate world. So it's interesting. I think there's definitely a different perception and understanding of putting yourself out there with people that have been in corporates for a long time versus entrepreneurs who are perhaps a bit more comfortable with this space.
Absolutely. So can you tell us a bit more about your book? It's called Unknown to Unforgettable. I've got it here in front of me. Look, I've got a picture of it. I know they can't see that, but
amazing.
Right here in front of me.
I can see that.
Yeah,
fantastic.
It's going to be my holiday read, so I'm looking forward to that. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Sure. So I've had my own podcast for just over a year now called Beyond the Bio, and the podcast started because I was sat next to a studio all the time and the team kept saying to me, why have you not got your podcast? You need to practice what you preach. And I thought, yep, you're absolutely right. So I started it just over a year ago. It's a very short 15, 20-minute show, comes out every Monday and features a tiny element of profile each week. So we've covered a lot of the topics that I just mentioned earlier. And it got to a point where I thought, I've talked about so much here and the podcast is growing. I think there's a book in here. So that was where the idea came from. And what people will find if they pick up the book is, or listen to it, because that's the in thing. Everyone's doing audiobooks now. But what people will find with the book is that it does cover all of those topics. So it starts off with, starts off with a foreword from Sarah Davies, which is pretty cool. But then it goes into the first chapter, which is around how do you work out what you stand for? Because that's a really key starting point if people don't know what their messaging or what their brand is. And then it goes through a number of chapters which cover all of those topics. So we've got networking, we've got press and media, we've got awards, we've got podcasting, speaking, and social media. So all of those different things. And then within each chapter, there's various activities to do. There's take action points, because I'm a big fan of not just consuming content and actually doing something with it. And then there's a load of resources that come with it to make it a bit easier as well.
Yeah. And can I just say, I love that about your podcast and your book, about the taking action piece, because I think often with this particular topic about sharing your value, up in your profile, having influence, we do suffer with the procrastination piece. So I do love that about both of those tools that you've got, the podcast and the book. It is really cool, and it does sort of spur you into action. So let's go back to the foreword, because that was we skipped over that, and I think that's really interesting that Sarah Davies wrote your foreword. What's your connection with Sarah then? I know you do some work together, but that's pretty neat that she wrote that for you, and she's got a great profile.
She has. And she described my book last week as the personal branding toolkit. So thank you very much for that, Sarah.
Yeah.
But Sarah and I are both from the Northeast, and the Northeast is quite small, right? So you do bump into people and you do see people. And I think I met Sarah, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, so pre-Dragon's Den. And I actually remember, I think I remember the first time I met her. I think she spoke at a conference that I went to that was local, and she was talking about Crafter's Companion and how that all came about, and I really liked her. I thought she was great. And then our paths crossed again at the Great British Entrepreneur Awards. I think, was it the Great British Entrepreneur Awards? Yeah, it was, the year that she won. And I just released my first book at that point, and I was telling her about it, and I ended up sending her one, and she put it on her socials. And I think she just started Dragon's Den at that point. And then we sort of stayed in touch a little bit. And then when COVID hit, I did my second book, and I asked her if I could interview her for that. And then I turned that into a podcast. So I had a bit more of an in there. And then the key point, I think, where I got to know her a bit more was when I started my voluntary role as chair of SmartWorks Newcastle, which is a female unemployment charity, and I chair Newcastle, which covers the Northeast. And one of my first board meetings, I'd said to my board of trustees, what's our priorities? What is it that we're working on? And they said, we really need an ambassador for the charity. It's something we've been talking about for years. And I thought, all right, who's on your list then? And Sarah was top of the list. And I thought, oh, great, I do know her. So I knew, I was pretty confident she'd reply. I didn't know whether she'd do it, but I was pretty confident she'd reply. So anyway, I sent her quite a serious email with my full pitch in as to why she should do it. And I got quite a quick response, but it was quite formal. And I thought, is she trying to fob me off here? Because it's not as friendly as she normally is. And basically she was saying that because she was on Dragon's Den, it had to go through all these people at the BBC and this agent and all these people before she could explore it, basically. So I, all right, great, whatever you need, just tell me and we'll go along with that process. And then really quickly they came back. It was only a day or so later saying, we think it's a great fit. How do we move things forward? So I messaged her and said, I'm so happy that you're going to be doing this. And I got the most enthusiastic reply back saying, I immediately wanted to say yes, but I can't do that anymore because, of all the TV type things and the contracts I've got, but I'm really excited. So then she became our first ambassador, and she's done some amazing work for the charity. And we got her at the perfect time for us and for her, because she then went on to do Strictly the same year. So I think we got in just at the right time. So I do speak to her fairly often with SmartWorks stuff. I was with her last week. We opened the new SmartWorks Centre in Newcastle last week. But what I absolutely love about Sarah is what you see is what you get. And she's been so supportive of me. So when I reached out to ask her if she'd write the foreword for the book, she didn't actually reply for a while. And I didn't want to chase her because I didn't want to feel like I was leaning on her too much when she does a lot for the charity. And then I got this email out of the blue for her saying, oh my God, I can't, I've just seen this. Am I too late? You need to nudge me on shit like this when I don't reply. And I was like, no, it's not too late. It was literally, I had about a day where we could turn it around, and bless her, she turned it around for me literally the same afternoon, and which was brilliant. And then with the launch, all the launch activity a couple of weeks back, she messaged me, what can I do to help you with the launch? I said, well, I've sent you the book and I've sent you some instructions around how you could promote it. And she did 2 LinkedIn posts, an Instagram post, an Instagram story. And the sales just went through the roof on the day where that went live. And we did have some other stuff going on as well. But, I'm very confident that a lot of those sales have come through. In fact, I spotted a review on Amazon this morning where someone mentions the fact that they bought it because of her telling them to, essentially. So that's definitely had a big impact. But she's just really sound, very genuine, a great leader.
Amazing leader, and like she's on my top, like if you could list some female leaders, she's up there. I found her really engaging and approachable on social media, and I don't know her, so that in itself,
she's exactly like that.
Yeah,
amazing.
But it just goes to show as well, doesn't it, like how you've used connection there in your local area to get a level of influence. And, you've shared the value that you're demonstrating in your space, and she's connected with that and then got on board with you. So great forward in the book, strong. And then you go into all of these amazing, like what I call strategies for entrepreneurs or leaders, execs who want to create influence and up their profile. And, like you said, you've got things like, what do you stand for? That's really important. And I think we often get sucked into organizations and think, I just stand for the organisation. But you don't, we make up the organisation. So that's cool. Becoming an authority, maximising speaking opportunities, award-winning formula, media mastery, board influence, which is massive. The amount of times we're talking about influencing exec teams, boards and trustees from a leadership level. So that's going to be hugely helpful to leaders. Networking, being the networking ninja, love that. And then you've got like this action plan. Making it online, an action plan. And again, I think, I often hear in my sessions, leaders really struggle with the concept of having an online presence when you belong to an organisation. When you're an entrepreneur, it's you, your business is you, isn't it? But when you're a leader in an organisation, that's not as easy to have your own identification. Can you give the audience any kind of tips about that? Because I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And if you're working for a larger organisation, then you probably have a social media policy, and there's probably some cultural stuff around what is expected in that and how far you can go with things. And I think that there's still something that you can do online. So I often see, I guess LinkedIn's probably the platform that they would be thinking of in terms of professional use. And you often see people from corporates who are LinkedIn lurkers, so they're on it all the time, and they you'll bump into them at an event and they'll say, I saw you did this, and you think, have you been like looking at my stuff? Because you've never noticed a like or a comment or any kind of engagement on stuff, but they are very active in their lurking. And I think it's sometimes that kind of lack of understanding around what is acceptable within their business. Therefore, they just avoid it rather than try something out or ask the questions. So, if someone was listening that's a leader in a corporate, I'd be saying actually it's a real opportunity, because they're few and far between leaders in corporates that actually do post stuff. So, if you don't have to be controversial, especially on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's not a hugely controversial platform. So, if you're in a particular function within your business, can you just share some really useful, valuable information? Can you make reference to an article that you've seen that you think would be interesting to your audience? Can you provide an update on something really cool that's happening in your organisation? Are you visiting another branch or area of your company, and could you take a cool picture and talk about why it's so exciting that you've travelled from X to Y to have a look at what's going on in this space? So there's so many things you can do that would not cause any offence, that would meet anyone's social media policy, but just give yourself a bit of visibility. And I think there's a couple of reasons why you would want to do that within a larger organisation. When I think back to my John Lewis days, I was always told in my early 20s, you need to raise your profile. well, what the hell does that mean? And I used to get told it all the time. And what I realised after a few years was that it was kind of saying yes to things actually and just being a bit more visible. So I remember the general manager in Newcastle saying to me, oh, I'm going to put you on this project because it will raise your profile. And I did a project that was with the local council and also with our store, and it was something around a customer collection point or something. It was quite interesting, to be fair. And that did raise my profile, but I didn't really realise the benefits of that at that point because I was so young and so inexperienced in my career. But it is important. And I think it's important as well if you do end up leaving that business, because there aren't really any jobs for life in the same way that I feel like there was at that point, or you certainly felt like there was. And like I said before, you know, a lot of my former colleagues at John Lewis, they've been there for like 25, 30 years, and then they go through a redundancy program and they're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And no one knows who they are outside of John Lewis. And they feel like, oh, well, I've got that brand behind me. But actually the reality is there's no trace of them anywhere. So yes, they've got that on their CV, but usually their confidence is knocked if they've gone through a redundancy process. And actually, if they'd just been fairly active on LinkedIn and probably doing some external networking, they'd have been in a much stronger position. Like there's a guy I used to work with who's been there, he's definitely been there over 25 years, and he's just taken redundancy, and he's actually been quite proactive, and he's gone to join a friend who has a recruitment agency, and he wants to see whether he wants to buy into that, and he might well end up doing that, which I think is quite cool, and I think that'd be a good fit for him. But you know, I said to him, like, if anyone was to Google you, there's nothing in existence. You've got the most basic LinkedIn profile that you've never posted on. There's nothing there, especially if you're going into recruitment. You need to be visible. So I've been giving him a bit of advice about some of the stuff that he should do. And, you know, he was just very naive thinking, oh, I'll be at John Lewis forever. He'd been there since he was 16 or 17. And actually, the reality is he now needs to really show up in all these other places to be able to do his next job.
It's crazy, isn't it? Because at the moment, we've mentioned the word restructure, I think 2 or 3 times on this podcast already. You know, redundancies, change in organisations, it's just rife, and reorgs, and people are having to kind of reinvent themselves all the time in new roles to innovate, to get ahead. And I often talk about in my value sessions around how you need to be influential before you actually even get into that recruitment process or before the restructure starts. So you are on people's minds, you are holding weight in that space, you know, people know that you are credible and that you can do the role and the value that you can bring. And it's not just all about that kind of 20 minutes in the chair in the interview these days, you know, it's a much bigger influential piece around sharing this value, isn't it?
It's invisible PR. So have you heard Stephen Bartlett talk about invisible PR?
No, I haven't.
There's a really interesting clip that I use sometimes in a workshop where he talks about invisible PR and what people say about you when you're not in the room. And I think that has a really big impact, because if you are going through a restructure internally, you want whoever's on the interview panel for the job to know who you are. And if you're visible, whether it be on LinkedIn or just whether it's within your own organisation, by sharing what you're doing and being visible around the stuff that you're doing internally, that is going to put you front of mind straight away. And I really like that Stephen Bartlett clip, because he talks about, you know, this, what people are saying about you when you're not in the room. And he gives this cool example of when he's on a plane and he's going to, I don't know, America or something, and he meets this guy from Man vs. Food, I think he says it is. I don't know who the guy is, but he talks about this guy. And apparently in Stephen Bartlett's business at the time, it was when he was at Social Chain, I think, they had this tradition where they would ask people what their favourite sandwich was, and it was like this in joke, and he talks about it, and he puts in his group chat, there's hundreds of people in this group chat, oh, this Man versus Food guy's on the plane, I'm going to go and ask him what his favourite sandwich is. And he goes up to him on the plane and he goes to speak to him, and as soon as he sort of even opens his mouth, this guy goes, not now, like, not now, and he kind of slopes back off to his seat, and he has to update the group chat to say, oh yeah, you know, it just wasn't a great time to catch him or whatever. And that was the end of that. But then fast forward a couple of years, and obviously Diary of a CEO becomes this big podcast, and he bumps into this guy again. Oh no, in fact, he mentions the story on his podcast, and then I think this guy gets in touch with him, and it's just so interesting that interaction then becomes this guy's persona because that's now their impression of him, and all these people have heard this and they've now seen this clip. So it's so interesting around, you know, how you treat people. But then he gives an opposite example of that, of some guy in the business, or a girl, I can't remember, who goes and gets someone a plaster when they've cut themselves or something, and then that plays a part in them getting a promotion, an internal promotion. And it's just all these little things that add up to someone's impression of you. It's really interesting.
It is so interesting. I'm sure we could link that to neuroscience too, you know, like how you make that impact in the first few seconds. Then once you are in the seat, you know, after you've done that first upfront stuff where you've made that invisible PR work for you, but then actually when you get in there, how you can influence with your spoken word, that kind of thing. I mean, that it is really, really interesting. Can you share some top strategies for building influence? Because that's the thing that our value module really links to, is how do we use our profile and value to influence in larger organizations? So, you know, like the influencing at board level, or having that invisible PR, like what would be the steps and strategies to do that?
I guess I would be saying, first of all, you need to work out what it is that you stand for and what you want to be known for. I think that's really important. And then everything you do after that is linked to that. So you have a brand and people know what you're about, and you've got some sort of personality, whatever that might be. And then I think within organisations, I think it's a case, for me, I think it's quite basic around doing what you say you're going to do. So if you're the one that's putting your hand up to commit to doing something, do you then see it through? Do people know you as the person that can be relied upon and that can add value in these situations? Because we can probably all think of examples of where someone might be the loudest person in the room, but actually they don't add any real value, or they steal other people's ideas. Or on the reverse of that, the person that will come to a meeting and say absolutely nothing and not contribute anything. And I think it's really important to know where your strengths lie and be able to identify those opportunities to contribute. And you know, I've been thinking about this a little bit lately because I've got quite a few hats in that I've got various responsibilities with lots of different things. And there's something that I'm involved in with the local Chamber of Commerce at the moment, which is like an advisory council. And I've been getting a bit frustrated because it's quite a large council and I feel like I'm not adding value in a way that I could do. So it's probably a combination of the way that the meetings are run and also me not finding my groove within that. So rather than just carry on, because I genuinely feel like it would make no difference if I was there or not at the moment, what I've done is I've reached out to the CEO of the Chamber to say, I think that there is a better way that I can contribute to this, and I feel like maybe now is a great time to perhaps change, because we've got a new president of that council, so it's a good opportunity to maybe review the structure of the meetings to make sure that having all these great people around the table, awesome, but if people aren't really contributing, and that would be my observation of a lot of the group, then how do we make it better? So actually, rather than just being this passive participant in these meetings, I'm now trying to use this sort of reflection to go back and say to them, hey, let's make it better and let's see what we can do.
Love that. So that's like a proactive piece, isn't it? And also looking for the opportunity to make change, create the space that you can operate within comfortably. Yeah, that's really cool. So if somebody was sort of like, you know, like we have quite a lot of high extroversion in leadership, particularly the higher we go. I often come across, you know, the value module's a real leveler. It kind of makes the extroverts kind of evidence-base their value and regulates that extroversion, but it also helps the introverts kind of up the energy for expressing themselves and finding their confidence within that. And they're the group that usually find this profile building the ick, you know, like what I was speaking about at the beginning. Do you have any kind of advice for them about how they can become authoritative, but in a way that's they would probably call classy? You know?
Well, I think this goes back again to working out what you stand for and how far you want to go with things, because we've all been on LinkedIn where we've seen a certain person or a certain style of post where we've cringed and we've gone, oh no, that's so painful. And, you know, I can think of a few people I need to mute at the moment where I find their stuff cringy. So I think it's working out, what do you feel comfortable with? And for some of us, we'll go further than others. So only ever do what you feel comfortable with, because I think there's something around that being authentic where you can't project this personality that you're not. You know, I would hope that anyone meeting me who hadn't met me before in real life feels that I am the way that I speak on my podcast or as the way I speak on LinkedIn. because I feel like that is me. And if they were meeting a different person, I would be like, ooh, that doesn't fit, that jars a bit. So I think that's important. And then I think there's something around just getting over yourself a little bit. So a lot of people will say to me, oh, it feels really cringe to talk about myself. And I'll say, well, you don't have to talk about yourself. You can talk about a colleague or clients or a topic. It doesn't have to be about yourself. So you park that. But then I think as well, it's actually taking a chance and having a go as far as you feel comfortable, and then actually sitting back almost to see the benefits of it. Because I think that what people always find when they're consistent, you can't just do one or two activities and think, oh, everything, I'm just going to turn into this magnet for all these opportunities. It doesn't happen. You've got to build it up. You've got to keep going. You've got to be consistent. But when that happens, what you do find is this snowball effect of things just appearing. It's weird. It's like some kind of magic, but that is what happens. And I think when people get to that point, they then just relax into it in any case. And you've got to just take those first steps to be making those strides forward to be able to get those benefits. So yeah, an element of being yourself and just staying true to that, being genuine and authentic, but also being consistent and sticking at it and then enjoying the benefits. Because, some people will worry, oh, what if I get trolled if I talk about this on LinkedIn or whatever. Is few and far between, especially for leaders in corporates who are realistically probably not going to say anything hugely controversial. Therefore, people are just going to scroll on by, or they'll like it and they'll get involved. But as well, it's remembering that it's not just about social media. It's about all these other things that we've been talking about. Social media just tends to happen to be the channel that we share these things on.
Yeah, totally. And as you were talking there, what was coming to my mind is this could have a huge impact on engagement and retention for organisations if leaders would take a responsibility for having a profile, even in just one of these spaces that you talk about in your book, because the visibility brings desire from people, attraction. I want to go and work for you. I want to work for that person. You sound really cool. I know more about you now. I just don't know, I'd be looking at your organisation, but actually I want to work for you as the leader. So I can see how that would really, really help with those kind of issues that corporates are faced with. Just touching on the networking piece, because again, that's, I think, sometimes can be a bit of a stretch for people in corporates, just because of time, but also because of understanding the value that it can bring. So can you talk a bit about how your personal brand can feed into networking and relationship building? Because I think that'll be really useful.
Yeah, I think networking is mega. And again, if I'm to reflect back to my John Lewis time, I didn't do any networking for so long because everything was so internal, and I would network within my branch. When I went to head office, again, network within the head office. The bit where that changed for me, and this was quite unusual because most people, that was how they operated in the roles that they were in, and there wasn't any need for them to go and do anything externally. But I ended up in this role where I was responsible for graduate recruitment. And one of the things that I did as part of that role was network with other graduate recruiters. So there was this thing that still exists called the Institute of Student Employers, the ISE. And one of the handover things that I had from my predecessor was, you need to join this. They have really good meetings. And I went to a meeting, and they used to have this thing called the Retail Sector Focus Group, which was brilliant. So I was basically networking with all my equivalents in other retailers, and it was so cool because we were a really open group. I'm actually still in a WhatsApp chat with some of them now where we chat about our guilty pleasure TV things like Love Island and Married at First Sight. So I'm still in touch with some of them even now, but that was transformational actually for me, was getting out and going to these meetings and sharing best practice and sharing information. And it was so useful. And I remember actually having a really funny conversation with a guy that's actually, ironically, now one of our clients at Moja, who was a senior buyer at John Lewis, and I was setting up a buying graduate scheme, and I got to go on a buying trip with him to Portugal. Sounds really glamorous. It wasn't, which was kind of part of the learning, but we were on this buying trip, and I was telling him about how I'm chatting to Helen at Marks and Spencer's or whatever, and he was outraged. He could not believe that I would talk to what he saw as a competitor, but I didn't see it that way. None of us did see it that way, and it would have been different in his space where it was obviously very commercially sensitive. But for us, if I had a graduate that had applied to me and M&S, I wanted them to choose the retailer that they actually felt a closer fit with values-wise or role-wise, if it was a role. And sometimes we would, say to them, if we were both offering to them, we would say, go and spend a bit of time in an M&S and a bit of time in a John Lewis and make the right decision. And I think that helped us with our goals around retention and getting the right people in and the right fits. So that was always really interesting. But I think, so a collaboration, that is brilliant for networking. Again, I would probably go back to the point around jobs aren't for life. So if you've got a network outside of your organisation, but that's still in the same industry, that is probably going to be super helpful if you're wanting to either progress your career perhaps somewhere else, or if you're in that unfortunate position where you have to do that, then you've got a ready-made network. But I think as well, it's looking at opportunities that complement your role. So I'm a big fan of volunteering. I've always had a voluntary role ever since I was in my early 20s. I've done all sorts of things. I've volunteered for 5 or 6 charities now and usually done a solid stint at each of them. And by networking in that space, you develop new skills that you can actually bring back into the workplace. So if I think about my role now as chair at SmartWorks Newcastle, I have the most dynamic board ever. They're super dynamic. And when I go to a board meeting, I come back out and I'm bouncing back because I'm so energized by all of their enthusiasm and all their ideas. And I'm learning and soaking up from them things that they're doing in their own organizations. Or if I'm at a networking event that's linked to the charity, again, I'm meeting new contacts that I can bring back to the day job. So it's amazing how much crossover there can be between all of these things. And I don't think you realise it, because I didn't when I was in those early days at John Lewis. But now that I'm outside of that, I very, very much appreciate that. And I think now, it's funny, when I moved back to Newcastle, having left John Lewis, I didn't know anybody in business at all. I knew the people at the John Lewis, but I didn't know anyone in business. And I was setting up my business in Newcastle. This is 11, 12 years ago now. And now I could probably put you in touch with anyone in Newcastle. Either I'd know them or I'd know someone that knows them. And it's a small place once you get out there. And I think, it's the same most places. Even in London, I could connect you to lots of people, and I'm there a fair bit, but I don't work there or live there anymore. But it's easy once you see those connections and you make those patterns. And, having LinkedIn is fantastic for that, because we're all connected to so many people on LinkedIn, and it's just joining up these dots and making those connections. And it's so useful, even if it's not useful to you right this second to connect this person with that person, it comes back, those sorts of things. And it's really nice to be able to be helpful for people.
Yeah, I love that. That really nice to be helpful, because you're giving value back. I think what we can't miss as well with value is that the actual impact it has on us, on our physiology, like how great we feel. Like you talked about that volunteering there, you talked about learning from that board, exchanging that information. And when we do that, our resilience does increase, doesn't it? And it allows us as leaders to have another perspective on not just the perspective that's in our organisation. So I just don't think that we can underestimate that in terms of the value that can add to us. So that's pretty neat. Do you have any top tips for somebody to build their personal brand instantly, like a 1, 2, 3? If they could go away from this podcast today, what would be the first 3 things that they should do to start building their personal brand?
Kind of slightly depends on where they're at the moment. So I'd probably direct them to the Moja website and say, do your quiz, or connect with me on LinkedIn and find the quiz in my LinkedIn bio, because what that does is it gives you a score for each area of your profile right now. So that's useful to have a baseline as to where you're starting from. But what I find when I talk to individuals is they all want to focus on something a bit different. So quite often I'll have people that will say to me, I really want to do more speaking. I want to speak at events. And that's quite common. But other people might say, well, actually, I really want my organisation to become award winning, or I want to win an award, or someone might want to write a book. So it's quite hard to just say, do all these things. So I guess if I was to try and pare it back and give advice that's relevant to everyone, one would be identify where you're at the moment. So whether you do our quiz, or whether you just Google yourself, or you just do a bit of reflection, all of those things are going to help establish where you're at now. And then it's probably identifying some goals of things that you want to be working on and things that you want to do. and coming up with an action plan to move towards that. So you might have some huge goals, and for some people things like writing a book might be this mega goal, but actually what can you do before that kind of breaks things down a bit or moves you a bit closer to that goal. And then I suppose the third thing would be to commit to taking some level of action, because it's great to read a book or consume content and think, right, I'm going to work on all these things, but unless you commit to doing something and probably write it down, it's unlikely to happen. And when I was starting out with the first business, I was really good at writing goals down, and I had some very basic goals around LinkedIn actually initially, where I don't know how many followers I would have had. It was connections in those days when I had the business. I think it was about 4,000 maybe when I left John Lewis. So it's not a right number, but it's not mega. And one of my things was that I knew I had to grow my LinkedIn audience as a business owner. So I would say, right, each month or each year, I think I did it by year, and then I would break it down to month, and I would think about how many new connections I needed to make and how many posts I should be doing. And so, it was really that level of detail. But actually, because I'd broken it down to that, and because I used to review it, I made progress. Whereas if I just said, oh, I know I need to work on my LinkedIn, well, what does that mean, and how do I measure the progress? So yeah, I think I'd probably have something around that.
Yeah, I like that. It's all bite size. Doing the quiz is definitely a great place to start, and that's open to execs, isn't it, to do that quiz, and they get 100%. A score about their profile. Yeah,
100%. And we're doing quite a lot of work with corporates now as well, to be fair, because I think corporates that are savvy are realising that this kind of thing's really important, because if people in corporates become a bit more visible, then actually it's spotlighting the organisation and almost becoming brand ambassadors for their own organisation.
Yeah. So have you got a programme then that sits with the...
Yeah.
So, and does that break it down like what's in the book? Is that...
Yeah, kind of. So we've got a programme that we can use with corporates where they basically they can either have what we do with entrepreneurs and founders, which is they can have a retained service where we work with an individual that's quite senior, usually in an organisation. We do stuff one-to-one where we do it for them. Or we've got this corporate programme where we can put probably around 8 leaders through a program where you've got different modules depending on what the organisation wants. So most organisations want the LinkedIn side of things, so that we're showing them what to do with LinkedIn. Some want awards, some want networking. So you've got these modules that they can kind of mix and match, and because we're running it in their organisations, it can be tailored to suit their particular organisations. So I think it's forward-thinking organisations that realise the value of this kind of thing and how it can fit with them.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Oh, Soph, it's been great to have you. Thank you so much. Where can listeners go to find out more about you?
LinkedIn's a good spot, so maybe we'll pop a link to my profile in your show notes.
Yeah, love that. Would love that. Thank you so much. This has been great to have you. Thank you for listening and being a fan of the Pivot Leadership Podcast. You are a pivot leader, and I love working with you, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Pivot Leadership Podcast. For any information on anything we've discussed in this episode, head down to the show notes. You'll also find my Pivot scorecard there, so you can take the test and see what your Pivot score is right now. Don't forget to like, rate and share the podcast and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes.